Engines on. 5, 4, 3, 2, liftoff. We have liftoff with Apollo for the Apollo.
What does that constitute? These various, these various theories that what use do people put them to, if not to a certain kind of critical engagement with their own production, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I don't think we should spend the evening discussing my philosophy of teaching. I'll summarize it in 3 sentences. I don't think we know how we got from 1970 to now. That's why I think it's preposterous to pretend that we do. I think that works of art are made by people who are, by definition, narcissistic and nuts, and that art doesn't come from nowhere, so there's always a point of origin or several points of origin within art and outside of it. But what's happened to it, because of who's got a hold of it, is something else. And so people have to be able to theorize what they're doing. Certainly they have to know some theory, to do some philosophy, but they have to be able to theorize what they're doing from a position which may be, by definition, uncertain, and won't be a matter of locating themselves within a fixed context. And I think people need to understand that the nature of change is that it's not always the same, and that we don't actually know what art is anymore, and that we have graduate schools -1, which can only work if we proceed from the notion that we don't actually know what it is we're teaching. That's my philosophy about education.
Well, I mean, on that point, I mean, Steve, you were talking about the artist as a kind of iconoclast. There's a certain amount of agreement, I think, in what you're saying, Jeremy, right? There's a certain kind of agreement in that sense. But then again, the art school is typically sort of formulated as a space where, a certain sort of set of rules, perhaps, or codes, or languages, or discourses, or practices are taught to a large group of people, right? So there is necessarily a degree of conformity there, even if the conformity is sort of an avant-garde conformity about breaking the rules, right, as you're saying.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I don't want to hog the conversation, but I think the way you have an interesting graduate school is that you assemble as many people who are good at what they do, which means they have public reputations, blah, 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 and who violently disagree with one another. And that's a faculty. And if possible, they disagree with one another in front of the students, and that will demystify the notion of mastery and authority. And that is a situation in which people will, by default, and also because they're being implicitly encouraged, to think for themselves. And that is, of course, you mentioned self-criticality. Well, that's what self-criticality means. It means think of yourself. So it's hard for me to locate an implicit conformism in such a structure. I wouldn't know. I don't think it is conformist. I think there may have been a time. I graduated from art school in 1970. There may well have been a time when there was great pressure on people in art schools to conform to the dominant style. But I think, although one could certainly find examples of that, I think in general the difficulty of identifying a dominant style has begun to erode that, even in places where people would want to preserve it. So in general, I think you're not doing badly when it comes to conformism in graduate education at the moment.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in another quote. This is, again, from a time where perhaps conformism was more evident. This is Lane Relier writing about the present and writing about pluralism in relationship to, again, the sort of post-war period, as he puts it, when all painters walked around with the same cognitive maps in their heads, and they all agreed on what the issues were concerning surface, or process, or color, or shape, or edge. Clearly at that point, there was such a thing as the mediums specific, and there was like the idea of the dominant medium. And this again brings up the question of how do you conduct a discussion of art in a kind of pluralistic moment, or a moment where you acknowledge there's no dominant medium, there's no dominant ideology. We're kind of shuttling between a notion of the art school as center and the, let's say, the art world, the gallery world as center. How do you kind of discuss, how do you kind of conduct a discussion of art, or how do you sort of evolve a discourse of art? Because the conformity I'm talking about is simply that you kind of pass on a language, right, to the students of a certain kind of self-criticality, and it has to be understood to some extent between those students and between the larger art world, right? There still has to be some sort of a language. But what does it consist of, is what I'm wondering at this point. If anyone has a thought.
I didn't go to art school, and I don't teach at art school, so I can't say anything about that. But I would say, one thought I have as we hear the conversation, it keeps school, gallery. There's a whole bunch of other important players in this thing. There's the consumer, and there's several kinds of consumers. There's the collector, there's the nonprofit space, there's the opinion giver, the judge, the critic. So, there's art that only appeals in the nonprofit venue, that's only shown there, and they have no career in the commercial sense, but they get monies to participate. There are certain artists who get reviewed in Art Forum repeatedly, and that's one of their universes. So there's no easy way to draw a big generality between and just keep galleries at one end and art schools the other. There's all these other players in it, and everyone gets their vote. Some people get more than one vote. And some people get, just like a fraction of a vote. But there's a whole bunch of factors involved between the gallery and I don't think the galleries have the most power in this. But I mean, they have a certain amount. But it's a confluence of many things that kind of yield a result or a place in the art world. So just not just gallery and school.
So you're saying everyone gets a vote, so it's the public that decides that?
No, I don't think the public, it's like, art's like the only market that I understand, really, that I can think of where it's really paid for by just a few people. In other words, you can go to any gallery for free, and it exists because a few people bought some work, and it's free for everybody else. Like, it doesn't work that way at a concert. Everyone buys their ticket, in museums, everyone buys their ticket. It's not like, there's just a few benefactors and everyone gets to go for free. I mean, sometimes it does, but it's really a very odd market, an odd system in the way that it's supported. So, no, I don't think the public gets much vote, really. I think that, there's, there's the MoCA show that just ended, the Art in the Streets. I mean, there was a lot of traffic at that show, a lot of people, so they voted, but they're not going to have much influence over which artists are going to get another showing or are going to have a career. So, I mean, certain people have big votes, the ones who spend, a lot of money, and they can affect things like, Saatchi or Rubel or people like that have pretty big votes. They have, they're like Texas or something. It's a big state versus Rhode Island or something. The votes are not. It's not. There's no electoral college, or actually maybe there is an electoral college, and big states, big voters get to influence the outcome. But it's a very odd system, the way it's supported. I can't think of another market system that functions the way the art world does. Can you?
Well, I think Art in the Streets was a good example of, there you can certainly make a kind of distinction between different parts of the art world, right? And different
Absolutely.
audiences and
Absolutely.
different publics.
Look, there's, look, just look at the auctions, I mean, there's a number of departments. There's a contemporary department, there's the modern and contemporary department, there's the Chinese market, there's the American market, there's the photography department, and they overlap sometimes, and then there's the furniture market, and, if you're Jorge Pardo, you could be in any number of them. So, we like to divide things up neatly. But in the end, it's where the divisions are very blurry that it's the most interesting. So I don't think that it's going to be very satisfying to like have a set of rules that works for your way of thinking, because just when you think you understand it, you hope anyway to find the exception that takes you in a whole new way. At least that's what I hope for. I don't think there's like a clear path. I think what I think today will be, gone, in a year in terms of what's interesting and whatnot. And I'll still like different things, but I mean, it's the journey and the path of seeing new things and new ideas that reflect new generations and new times. I mean, it's just a much different world today than it was, 20 years ago and 40 and so forth. And that's what makes it interesting as a viewer, and it's hard to make a blanket statement about it.
It's true, and it makes me think a little bit of how that title, "Art in the Streets," right, is so like self-evident and pronounced without any kind of irony, right? It's like literally that's what it is, art in the streets. Yet it's in this space, and so it could be ironic, but it's not. Whereas this title, the title to this show, I would say does to me make me think of art school, in the sense I think it's very ironic, first of all, in the way that it kind of points back to one of the earlier grad school shows, Supersonic. This would be what follows the Supersonic, the Boom. But if you're going to play like a word association, right? Boom, the next word bust, and there's yes, and so you have this kind of like at least a sort of sense of like anxiety or trepidation, or again some kind of like understanding of where one is in relationship to the world, even though one's in the basement of LA Mart, right? Where this work is in relationship to a larger picture of the world, and on some level, even the title, I think, demonstrates that. So, and that's what I was sort of trying to get at, whether there's a difference. I guess Art in the Streets and Boom would be like really extreme examples, but whether one can see it in the works.
Itinerant painters and the like, Ami Phillips, or Thomas Chambers is a great example. I mean, they just have a very idiosyncratic style, and it's so clear when you get to know those artists, like, that they had a world of influence, and whether it was, Ship Mass or, Cigar Store Indians or whatnot, they developed how they developed from a kind of education system that was unique to that time. So there's definitely a difference between making art to please your colleagues on the street versus making art here that might please your art student colleagues and your faculty. I mean, and if you go to obedience school with a dog, you're going to get a certain kind of dog. I mean, it just makes sense that the environment you inhabit is going to affect you, but the individual certainly has a big say in where they go, afterwards. I always say about Cal Arts, and I know Cal Arts isn't in here, but visiting a lot of Cal Arts students over the years, I kind of liken it to chemotherapy. And like when, unless they're super strong, their hair is gone, when they leave school. And it takes time to come back. Sometimes it's a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, but gradually they stop with the cliches that are very, very common. Post-colonial will drop out like 3 years later, but it's there for the first few. And so it's interesting to see what people take from their particular education, and I think there's good to be taken and bad, and it's not a value judgment. I think it's great, but it all depends upon the individual.
I think the street art show was a pretty good show. I enjoyed it, but I think it demonstrates something. If you compare it with the works in this show, there is no stylistic unity here. Everybody in this show has tried to actually make an individual work. There's fantastic stylistic conformism, in the street art show. And I'd suggest there is always an outsider art too. And that's precisely because they're not informed. It's precisely because they can only adopt and use pre-extant styles. You just made the best argument for having graduate school that's been made tonight. It's not outside of the academy that you discover how to be self-conscious or an individual. It's only in the academy that you get a shot at doing that. That's what this show demonstrates, for good or bad.
Nice. Maybe we should open up for the questions.
And you know, I have been teaching in American colleges since 1968. And I make, therefore, the obvious point. There's lots of different ways in which you can be a good teacher, because students need different things. So the question needs to be more specific to get anywhere, really.
I did like the School of Athens analogy.
That was Plato, boring guy. On and on.
But I think it's also true that, you know, schools also have their different, well, there's different schools, as Jeremy said, and they have different orientations, but they also, their orientations change over time, and there's these sort of high points and perhaps low points, and that's also kind of interesting to sort of keep track of in a certain way, because even though it's not creating conformity, I mean, because that's a pejorative term, I think, you can create a kind of you know, common enthusiasm or something about a certain set of issues, or you can create a common language that is productive and not simply stifling, right? Like an art rap or something. When I think I mentioned that the idea of discourse, one immediately thinks about something that's constraining and conventional and traditional. But you could also create a language that is full of possibilities and is very productive in terms precisely of allowing each individual artist to kind of come up with some new way of using that language, for instance. So yeah, without actually you know, mentioning any particular schools or periods in time, I do think that there is this kind of, oftentimes in at particular moments, production of a very kind of specific groups of people that sort of come out into the world with a language and a way of thinking and a way of working, right? But that's definitely subject to change.
That is an important point and certainly true, but hard to do much with excepting post facto. Certainly the intellectual history of American art involves that. It involves the emergence of particular little mafias from particular art schools that interjected into the general discourse particular concerns and preoccupations. And I'm not going to do it, but I could do it. I could tell you where in the 1970s the language of the Frankfurt Institute and Roland Barthes was first circulated, because I was doing it. I could tell you where it happened. And I could tell you, of course, we could do the same thing with certain ideas subsequently. But that's under the surface, and it's not by any means the whole meal when it comes to identifying what art schools are doing. And it's never exactly what the professors meant to happen. Once discourse gets into the hands of art students, it goes completely all over the place. And half the time it's being taught to them by people who don't fucking understand it in the first place. So you have this sort of wild, it's like there are versions of Walter Benjamin roaming around that make me cringe. And either I or Rosalind Krauss was the first person to use the name Walter Benjamin in American art criticism. So it's like, God save me from my disciples, to quote Oscar Wilde. So that's an intellectual history. You look at how ideas, where they first crop up because of particular people, and then how they're disseminated, how they're frequently immediately prostituted for careerist reasons, and et cetera, et cetera. Sure, that's something else. You could talk about that, but that's a different panel. Really.
I don't think it varies that much from place to place. I just think, you know, if you look at the statistics, more women go to graduate school than men, more men have galleries. People buy men's work because they think that it is more valuable, so in essence it is more valuable. So it's much harder for women to support themselves because they can't really sell work. It makes it harder to sustain a gallery career. So our organization tries to give various kinds of people visibility, not just women. But, and then we also do try to provide some sort of economic stability, just a little bit. But I think that's something that I think about and talk about with my friends a lot. How do you combat that? I know we have come up with various ideas for creating another economy or another system, but unfortunately the reality is that it's just it's really, really difficult.
I think, if I can just add to your question, it is difficult. It is a good idea for there to be extra help for women because, not to generalize, but I'll generalize. I made this point twice in the last year. I've taught for a long time. A lot of my best students have been women artists. In general, they've been people, though, who did this thing women artists do, which is, unlike the boys, they don't look for the winning team and try to join it. And so they tend to get involved, they think they're not going to get it on it anyway, and tend to do their own work. And for that reason tend, in my view, to do better and more interesting work than the generality. But for that reason are less attractive to the gallery system. Because first of all, yes, it is true that for reasons which the world has still not got over, art by white males costs 40% more generally than art by everybody else. And it's also true that art dealers, perhaps you're an exception, are looking for works which will enter into a recognizable historical succession, because really artworks are priced not in terms of their aesthetic affect, but in terms of whether they're historically significant. This red monochrome is worth 1,000, that's worth 100,000 because the $100,000 one is the one that's historically significant. It's total crap. So, yeah, I think it's good. I think it is to the point that women still need extra help.
Mm-hmm.
That thing
well,
that's lacking in that
I don't know. I mean, what I meant, I think I was getting to the question of artists who feel isolated, whether in Los Angeles or elsewhere. I think artists who feel isolated, if they live in New York, or they live in Los Angeles, or they live in Berlin, or wherever, London, are isolated because they're doing work which is in one way or another not assimilable or understandable, or whatever verb I'm searching for, in terms of the dominant fashions of the time. So, at the time of minimalism in New York, there were, whatever it would have been, 85% of the artists in New York felt they didn't have anything directly to do with the art world unless they were pop artists, which is the other half of minimalism. I mean, I'll make one provocative remark of the night. I know you're all waiting for it. Los Angeles has only ever been, to me, I've lived here since 1980, it's never ever been interested in anything but pop art. When I arrived it was Ed Ruscha. Now it's Paul McCarthy. I don't see the difference, excepting that with Paul you could say finally we have arrived at a state where we can say bad taste is the new good taste. But otherwise I see no change. So this is the only city where Robert Ryman ever had 2 exhibitions and didn't sell a single painting. So there are going to be various kinds of artists in LA, as elsewhere, who don't feel they have much to do with the art world in LA. That was what I was getting at. And I would think it to the point that every MFA program produces about 50% of its product falls into that category too. And they are, in a rather important sense, as much a part of the art world as the part that the art world officially recognizes, or whatever that is. Yeah. That was the point I was making.
I was thinking a little bit about the, the isolation in a number of ways. First, the idea that LA was isolated from the rest of the world, which having no sort of gallery infrastructure that's really connected to the rest of the world. But that was a 60s, 70s phenomenon.
Yeah.
So we proposed it that way to ask the question if it is, how different is it presently? But yes, I think and I'm really thinking about it mainly as a kind of story that's told about LA art, and it goes right up to, Larry Pittman making the statement, I think in the early '90s, that LA art is good because of this quality called sweet neglect, which means neglect from the larger world, but also neglect from an internal infrastructure, the absence of collectors, absence of galleries, absence of museums, et cetera. But I really brought it up to kind of ask the question if that's any more the case, if that's a story that can be told about LA art, if LA art can be distinguished from any other art on the basis of that kind of story. Which again, I think is maybe one of the things that a show like this might lead one to ask.
Any other questions for our panelists? I'd like to thank Steve Turner, Jan Tumler, Eve Fowler, and Jeremy Gilbert-Roth for being a part of this evening's program. And we have a sound performance coming up about 10 minutes from now. Thank you all for being here tonight.